the second grade, I was obsessed with getting molested. Where I got the idea? Phil Donahue, kindergarten. If you're too young for Donahue, as you will more and more invariably be, picture Harry Potter 50 years from now. As Mama Maribel dozed on the couch, her long hair parted down the middle like the Mona Lisa, and her old gold corkscrewing up its smoke, the 50 years from now Harry Potter looked at the 35 years ago me through his glasses in the concave television screen and told me to beware. I coughed a little in the smoke and felt a tingle down in my corduroys. That same year, I had molested Cindy Sweeld in the coat room of Miss McKinstry's class. Miss McKinstry prudently separated the boys and girls for nap time onto two sets of little mats on either side of the room. But the coat room had two doors, and Miss McKinstry underestimated our motivation. As she scribbled at her desk, Cindy and I signaled past her ankles, laying on our stomachs and alternately humping our mats. I don't know how we knew this signal or which one of us invented it, but we understood it as instinct and wound our ways by imperceptible degrees, patient and slow and relentless, in the light dim to encourage rest, past chalkboards and building blocks and under tables, humping like two little inchworms until we entered through the coat room's opposite doors. In the coat room, I molested Cindy ruthlessly through her clothes, although it occurred to me that possibly she had molested me because she humped harder than I did, and because she was on top. The liaison was unsatisfactory in any case, and I tried again with the Nichols boys, ages 4, 6, and 7, when their mother Carla dropped them off to spend the night. I lined them up on the floor with their pajama bottoms next to them, and laid on top of each of them one at a time. All our little penises erected, and the tingle in my own felt so good, better than scratching a mosquito bite, better than the way it felt when Mama Maribel cleaned my ears out with a bobby pin. And somehow, I liked the middle boy, Bobby, more than his brothers. Bobby was the black sheep, the bad boy of the family, the first and the last one always to get in trouble. If any of them were capable of molesting me for real, it was Bobby. But he never showed any interest because he was past tolerating our little game. Somehow, anyway, I realized that a molester would need to have some power, be bigger and stronger than I was. And so I changed my tactics. Going forward, I focused on the older boys in the neighborhood and tried to position myself for future tortures. There was Peter, down the alley, whose house was missing most of its siding, and whose parents kept a falling down camper from the 1950s in the backyard. Right off the alley, so convenient for sexual abuse. Peter took me in there once with the neighbor girl, Chrissy. I was 7 or so by now, Chrissy perhaps 4, and Peter told us we better suck his dick if we knew what was good for us. He took it out of his pants, and though he was 11 or 12 at least, I noticed he had no hair down there like some of the older boys I had seen in the shower at Holiday Lake. He told Chrissy to do it first, and threatened us both that if we didn't, he'd make us walk around the block naked. Oh, that was an unnecessary threat from my part, because I was going to do it anyway, though the absence of hair was dismaying, and in spite of the fact that this was not exactly the way I had envisioned my molestation. I don't know what I imagined it to be exactly, in the most logical sense, but generally speaking, it involved someone getting on top of me. Well, Chrissy did it first, mechanically, the way you might drop a nickel in your pocket. Then I did it with similar enthusiasm, and Peter peed a little in my mouth. Furious and double-crossed, I spit on the camper floor and went for the handle of the door, but Peter reached it first and held it a second. He told us not to tell, but he was mainly looking at me, and said if we did, he would beat us up and make us walk to 7-Eleven naked. Chrissy said okay, and I just nodded a little. But as soon as he let go of the door, I jumped down and ran through the alley. A few steps in, I turned and yelled back at the leaning camper, "I'm telling!" I left Chrissy at the dust and ran down the alley and into our little house and told my mother everything, except that he had had no hair. Half hour later, having reparted her Mona Lisa hair and smoked 2 Ogolds back to back, she took my hand and tramped down to Peter's house with me at the end of her arm. Not the shortcut through the alley, but the longer official route around the block. When Peter's mother opened the door, there was no time for pleasantries or small talk. Mama Maribel set straight at her face. Peter made Fonzo fillet him. For what? The woman said stupidly through her peroxide bangs. She turned red as a Corvette as my mother refreshed her vocabulary. The next year there was PJ, whose yard backed into ours and who terrorized the neighborhood on a white bike doing an impression of a police siren. So good an impression that cars would pull over in the street when he rode by, and all the housewives on Lane Street would look and pull back their curtains to see what the emergency was. My adult self might have thought of PJ as a high-functioning, mentally challenged person. My 8-year-old self just thought he was a dumb retard and a bully. When summer break came, PJ stayed home by himself during the day while his mother went to work. When he wasn't endlessly circling the block doing his police siren, he played demolition in his backyard with model cars. I would be just across the fence, largely unsupervised, making streams and dams and entire river towns, sometimes with the green garden hose on full blast. He never paid much attention to me, generally, except once when he karate chopped a caterpillar I had caught that had become a chrysalis. But one day, he needed help with his demolition, or so he said, and he invited me through the hole in the fence. He said his mother didn't allow anyone in the house when I said I wanted a drink of water. Disingenuously, now that I think of it, since the water hose was still blasting just across the fence. But he got around this little rule by letting me wait in the basement for him, which could be reached through a cellar door around the side of the house. When he showed up, he had a plastic machete in his hand instead of the water and held it to my throat and ordered me onto a piece of foam rubber on the floor. He did get on top of me, and I remember being very excited by this. He said the word cunt 3 or 4 times, but it was wasted on me because I thought cunt was what a cow chewed. I was very scientific. The whole thing was over in less than a couple of minutes, and I never did get to see him without his clothes on. The Thomases lived across the alley. They were Catholic and had 10 boys. I had never noticed their family because of the way they were built. They were all big and husky and played football in the fall. Somehow I knew my molester would have better proportions. But at some point before we left Lane Street, the Thomases started taking in foster kids, and one of the first was a troubled 17-year-old named Jake, who was mixed. He was the first man of color I had considered in my saga. It was Waterloo, Iowa in the 70s. There wasn't much color to choose from. But Jake and I never panned. I was close to 10 by now, and I started to hang out in front of the Thomases' house trying to act cool. To that end, I once hawked a loogie right onto the sidewalk. And Jake picked me up by my feet and cleaned the spit with my sandy afro. Around the same time, I spent the night at my Aunt Tam's. One of her boyfriends came in the middle of the night drunk. I was asleep on the couch, roughly the same size as my aunt, beneath a thin sheet while he fumbled around in the dark. I believe he mistook me for her and put his head under the sheet and kissed up my legs until he found something that definitely did not belong to my aunt. In those few seconds before he found his folly, I reeled with pleasure and fear, thinking it was really about to happen after all that time. To manifest my disappointment with the drunken interloper, I stared ruthlessly at him the next morning from my cousin Josh's sit and spin. He never looked at me once. I was invincible again. But at least I knew what a man's stubble felt like between my legs. Around 11 or so, driving one night back from Grandma's house on Holiday Lake, I laid in the back seat, pretending to be asleep under my jacket. My mother and her boyfriend sat in the front listening to something on public radio about a man who had been raped somehow by another man. The program said how such a thing was an act of aggression and power rather than sex. This was a good enough explanation for me, but I rubbed myself furiously and silently through my parachute pants. By this time, we had moved from Lane Street to a bigger house on the west side, which Mama Maribel and I shared with Tam and Josh. The house was nice, but pretty smoky between Mama Maribel's old goals and Tam's cools. There was a grapevine in the back, and a little black boy named Marquise who lived around the corner. I had given up, kind of, being molested. I was in middle school and I figured I was too old. But I had more sexual energy now than ever before. So I started messing with Marquise. He was several years younger than I, and there were many times he didn't want to, but I talked him into it. My main course of action was to make him lay on his stomach, and I would pull his pants down and grind on his butt. But once, right in the middle of it, I felt this overpowering sensation down there with all that grinding, and I jumped up and ran to the bathroom thinking I was peeing on myself. Marquise ran in after me. He looked at my penis and said, "Ugh, what's that, Fonzo, snot?" Next year, we moved back to the east side on Smith Street, the blackest neighborhood we had ever lived in. And my mother worked nights at the halfway house downtown, so I ran the neighborhood. Two brothers lived at the end of the block, Jermaine and Antoine Brown, identical to each other almost, except that one was bigger than the other. They were both very dark, with very defined bodies, and walked around a lot without shirts. And each had his hair cut in what we used to call back then a shag. Little one, Antoine, would come over sometimes after school, and he would tell me all about the girls he had fucked in the pussy. And we wrestled a lot, and it got pretty heated. Once he even pulled my pants down over my butt and moved around a lot on top of me until he told me he came. That was the first time I had heard of the term, and he showed me his dick as proof, I suppose, but I didn't see anything there except a small green booger. I wasn't as disappointed at this as I was at the fact of it not being his brother. You see, Antoine was smaller than I was, and his brother was bigger. I was sure Jermaine could have produced a more exciting result. That year, we moved to Minneapolis, and I talked my mother into my first Jerry curl in the frenzy of celebration. I was pretty sure I looked like Michael Jackson when I reached the south side of Minneapolis, sleek and mature, and ready as could be for the 80s. There was a porn shop a few blocks from our house at the corner of Lake Street and 4th Avenue, and I would pull a baseball cap low over my curl and sneak in, past the fat, dozing proprietor sitting at a desk high above the racks of magazines and into the quarter booths in the back of the place. Once the man was awake and asked me if he could see an ID, and I tried to give him my social security card, but he told me to get out. So I took to waiting behind the store, in temperatures well below freezing in the middle of my first Minnesota winter, until someone came out the back door. I would catch the door and slip in the back to where the quarter booths were without having to walk by the man at the counter. It was inside those booths, with my hands quivering from nerves, dropping quarter after quarter into the slot, that I first discovered what gay sex actually was. I mean, I really didn't know what I had believed up to that point, but I honestly didn't think that men fucked each other like that. Now, once or twice a man approached me or tried to enter with me into a booth, but I resisted. I guess the right one never came along. When I was 15, I worked at Wendy's a few blocks further down Lake Street from the porn shop. I had braces by this time and contact lenses, and my curl had gone a little red in front as per the Times. I had a lot of regular customers, so I was not alarmed at the cash register when I started seeing the same little man over and over. He never ordered much, maybe a small fry or a side salad, but he looked past my auburn curl, deep into my contact lenses. One night after closing, as I was walking home in the dark, I heard a voice suddenly beside me there on the sidewalk. He asked me if I knew where to get some weed, which I certainly did by this stage, but there was something in his voice that I knew wanted more than marijuana. I didn't recognize him as first, as my customer from the restaurant, but he did seem familiar for some reason as I led him home. I was shaking in my shell-top Adidas, pretending I might have a stash at home. And when we reached the duplex on 4th Avenue, I looked in the window and saw Mama Maribel sitting there on the couch. Without now the part down the middle, her hair was home-permed and voluminous. Think Stevie Nicks, only long, mousy brown instead of blonde. I was surprised and a little angry to see her. She worked nights at the prison at Shakopee and chose of all nights but one of my final deflowering to be at home. But, of course, I wouldn't let a little thing like the presence of my mother deter me from a path at least 10 years now in the making. So, I let my guest around to the back, broke into the basement window, came up the basement stairs, let the man into the back door, and let him down to the basement. The actual event was as anticlimactic then as my recounting of it to you may be now. I hurried affair on the cold, cracked basement floor with none of the paraphernalia or know-how that might really get the pleasure receptors going. It felt physically good when it wasn't complete agonizing pain, but somehow the power relationship was off. I was 15, he was 24. In most states, I suppose, the law would have protected me as the victim. But I felt myself then in control. And I believe that even today, all these decades later, I would make him beg for my affection, just to see if he would do it, and deny him it outright, because all I really wanted was to submit. Years later, when I was in Cuba, I would see girls in their quinceañera dresses, floating by in the beautiful old Chevys, addressing to the world the news that they were women. At 15, they announced their alertness, their full capacity for sexual knowledge, their full citizenship into adulthood and all that follows. Their eyes would blink in the sun, and their trains would rise in the wind. And I would watch them in silence and whisper to myself simply,